In chapter 19, we're going to learn the future, both active and middle indicative. Now you notice there's no future passive in this chapter. The future passive is formed differently, and we're going to learn it in a few chapters. So in this chapter, we're going to look at the active and the middle forms in the future. In other words, we're going to learn how a Greek would say, I will go do something, for example. So how do you form the future active? Well, actually, in a sense, there's two basic ways. We're going to look at one way in chapter 19 and another way in chapter 20. But in chapter 19, what we're looking at is really the easier of the two formations to identify. And what we're looking at are verbs whose tense stem in the future is the same as their tense stem in the present. In other words, we're looking at words like akuo, because the present tense stem of akuo is aku, and in the future tense stem is also aku. So it's those kind of words, or what you might want to call regular, although I don't like that word, but the regularly formed futures. Okay, so how do these verbs form their futures? Well, it's simple. You start with the future active tense stem, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then you add a tense formative. Now, in the case of the future, it's a sigma. In other words, the Greeks took a sigma, stuck it on to the end of the future active tense stem to help form the future tense, the tense formative. But then they also added a connecting vowel, the same ones we're used to, and then they added the primary active personal endings. In other words, there's no new endings to learn here. But when you say I hear and I will hear, both forms are using the primary active personal endings. And so, for example, you get lusamin. There's your parts. Okay, the question then becomes, what about this future active tense stem business? Greek verbs break down into 6 basic tense forms. Now, if you've learned Greek earlier with a different textbook, you will have heard these different tense forms called principal parts. I don't use that terminology. It's technically, I don't think, correct in terms of English grammar. Principal parts are nouns, verbs, pronouns, that kind of thing. But I prefer to talk about the different tense forms. And so Greek verbs have 6 different tense forms. And if you were to look up a word like agapao in the index or in the full lexicon, you would see that they're all listed. And the first is the lexical form, which is the present tense form, agapao. The second one is the future active tense form. And in the case of agapao, you will see that it's listed as agapeso. Okay, that's the future active tense stem. And you'll notice, as I said earlier, the present tense stem is agapa, and the future active tense stem is agapa. Happens to have been, the alpha has been lengthened to an eta. We'll talk about that in a bit. But the point is, it's the same tense stem. There's no difference in this particular category of verbs, okay? So how do you get to know the future tense stem? Simple. You look it up in the lexicon. And I can still remember when I was starting to work on my method, my dad said, well, don't you just memorize all of them? I go, no, you don't have to memorize them. Well, of course you do. I said, no, you don't. There's triggers. There's indicators as you look at these inflected forms that will tell you what tense it is. Master verb chart. And so we're not going to be memorizing all these different tense forms. You'll be learning how to recognize them. Now, every once in a while, the tense form gets so odd and weird that I'll encourage you just to memorize it. But there's not many of those. How then do you know what the future active tense form is? It's simple. In the textbook, when I give you vocabulary, I will list the different tense forms for a verb. And it's the second tense form that's the future active. In other words, if you were to go to the back of the book and look up agapao, you would see agapao, there's your present active. Then you would see agapeso, that's the second of the tense forms. That means that's the future active tense form. Now, do you need to memorize that agapeso is the future of agapao? Why would you want to do a thing like that? Why would you want to do that? You've got a sigma. You've got your omega. It's got to be a future. There's nothing else it can be. Don't fill up that slot in your brain. It's not important. All right? Now, what I have done is instead of overwhelming you with all 6 tense forms at the same time, in the exercises, I've only given you, when you hit a certain vocabulary word, I only give you the tense forms that you know up to that point. And then in the following chapters, there's a final section called Previous Words, where I'm filling in the other tense forms for the words you've already learned. You'll see it in the textbook. So anyway, how do you know what the future active tense form is? You look at it in the textbook, and you say, will I recognize this if I see it, or do I need to memorize it? And for the most part, you should be able to recognize it when you see it, so why worry about it? So when you see the paradigm, it's very straightforward, isn't it? Luso, luces, luce, lucimen, lucite, lususi. The only thing you have to recognize when you see that is, there's a sigma. Now let me tell you something about English. We tend to stress the beginning of words. And that's just kind of inbred into us because the ending of most of our words aren't that significant other than singular to plural. German, on the other hand, most of the guts of a German word are at the end. And that's why the stereotypical German is so staccato-y. Because they have to say the end of the verb or end of the word very clearly to hear the inflectional endings. Greek is more like German in that sense than as in English. And so what you're going to have to do is you're going to have this natural tendency, even without knowing it, most of you, is to see luces, and you kind of let the ending blur. But you have to become Germanic in that sense. And when you look at these verbal forms, you have to look at every little letter. Because there's a lot of difference between luces and lues. Because in one case, you're destroying it now. In another case, you're going to do it in the future. And the only difference is that sigma. Okay? So pay close attention to every little letter, especially in verbs. Now, instead of learning these as exceptions, I want you to see that there's 2 different kinds of verbs that are absolutely regular, even though things are changing. Look at the 3 contracts. Agapeso, poieso, pleiroso. What's happened in all 3? Right. The final contract vowel is lengthened, hasn't it? Okay, that's a rule. In contract verbs, the final contract vowel lengthens before the tense formatives. Alpha and epsilons go to eta, omicrons go to omega. But that doesn't mean you have to memorize agapeso because it's not an alpha, it's an eta, I have to memorize it. No, you don't. You just know that contract vowels lengthen before tense formatives. Other than that, they're perfectly regular, okay? What's going on in the right-hand column? If you have the root blep, it goes into the present as blepo, I see, but it goes into the future as blepso. Why? Square stops. Why? Any stem that ends in a labial, when you add a sigma to it, you pronounce it as a ps. So why not write it as a ps, e? So blepso is I will see. In other words, as you're working on these verbs, you may look at it and recognize the vocabulary, which is a huge help. You kind of start on the right side of the word and work back in. We'll all become Hebrew here for a second. And you see the omega, you know your first person singular, but then you see a psi, you see a compound consonant that's got a s sound in it. Most likely, it's a consonant that swallowed up the sigma, because you don't have any Greek verbs that naturally end in a psi. Okay, so when you see that psi at the end, you think, okay, what plus a sigma forms a psi, labials? This could either be blepo, blebo, or blefo, right? Could be any of the 3 labials. If you have a stem dioc, you have a velar. Velar plus sigma forms see. So dioko means I pursue. Diokso is I will pursue. And all that's going on is that the sigma of the tense formative is getting swallowed. It's not being swallowed up. It's being rewritten. Because you can't say ks. You say ks. And a ks in Greek is a ksi. Okay? If the stem ends in a dental, tau, delta, or theta, guess what? It drops out right before a sigma. And so this baptizo is I will baptize. The point I'm wanting to make, though, is that these are regular changes. These are not things that you need to fill up memory slots in your brain with. These are patterns, they're common patterns, they're easily observable patterns. And you just learn the patterns and save yourself a lot of memory work. Okay? How do you form the future middle? Let's talk about the form first, then we'll talk about its meaning. Well, it's simple. You take the future active tense stem. See, there's going to be a future passive tense stem. It's the sixth tense form. So that's why I have to keep saying future active. You take the future active tense stem, you take a tense formative, you take a connecting vowel, big deal, but then you take primary middle passive endings. And so we have this verb poruomai, I go, and you have poru plus sigma plus omicron plus mitha in the first plural. Porusamatha is a future middle form, but guess what? What does that mean? All middles that you know so far are deponent. Regardless of what we discover it means, for the time being, all middles you have are deponents, and therefore porusamatha is translated, we will go. All right? It's a future middle. See, unlike the present where the middle and passive are identical, in the future, the middle and passive are two different forms. So actually you have future active, future middle, both of which are formed on the same tense stem, but they have different endings. And then the future passive, which is formed on a totally different tense stem. So it's porusamai, poruse, porusatai, porusamatha, porusesta, porusantai. Same endings we have with luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, luesta, luantai. But you're in the future. Deponents never have an active form. They always have a middle or a passive form. But they're always active in meaning. Now, how are you going to know if a verb is deponent in the future? This is something that you need to simply to memorize. In other words, here's this verb, gnosko. You'll notice that it's not deponent in the present. It's gnosko, it's not gnoskamai. But in the future, it's gnosamai. If the second tense form listed ends in omai, then you know it's a future middle deponent. It's just like present deponents. How do you know if a verb is deponent in the present? The lexical form, the first of the tense forms. And if it ends in omai, then it's a present deponent. But guess what? Just because a verb is deponent in one tense doesn't make it deponent in another tense. Deponency, if that's a word, is a function to some degree of the tense. Now there are some words like poruomai, which is deponent in the present. When it gets into the future, it's porusamai, and it's deponent in the future as well. But there are other words like gnosko, which is not deponent in the present, but when you see gnosamai as a second tense form, you know that it is a future middle deponent. It will not have a future active form. It will only have future middle forms. And because it's a deponent, you know it's always active in its meaning. I struggled with this for 2 years. But I struggled with it because I made it harder than it really was. Deponent verbs are very simple. They've lost their active form, but not their active meaning. And so they have to take their passive forms, but use them with an active sense. But remember, the full definition of a deponent is a word that is middle or passive in form, but active in meaning. And when you look at erchomai, because the middle and passive are identical in form in the present, you can't tell whether it's a middle or a passive deponent. And it doesn't matter. When you get into the future, because the forms are different between middle and passive, you can tell the difference. And so you have to understand it. When I can still remember, it was my second year of Greek. I actually had hitched a ride with my Hebrew teacher. And I said, okay, can you describe to me what a deponent is? And Dr. Madvig said, well, they're words that are middle or passive in form and active in meaning. Oh, that's really easy, isn't it? And he goes, yeah, what's your problem? Dr. Madvig would have said it much nicer than that because I was a basket case in Hebrew. That's why I teach Greek. But it really is simple, but it's easy to make it more complex. Finally, we have 2 new rows in our master verb chart. Okay? How do you form the future active? You take the future active tense stem. You take a tense formative, which is a sigma. You take a connecting vowel, same one we've always had. You use primary active, os, a, amaneta, usi endings. And so you get, for example, luso. How do you form the future middle? Well, you start with a future active tense stem. You have a tense formative, sigma, connecting vowel, but you have primary middle passive personal endings. And so, for example, you get porusomai. Can you see why this chart is absolutely critical? Because if you don't know this, you have to memorize the 900 different paradigm forms. But what I want you to be able to do is to look at a verb and do what all of us do who've known this language for a while, is that we don't know the paradigms, unless we're Greek teachers. We look at the words, or some Greek teachers, I should say. We look at the words, we look for the triggers, we're looking at the tense formatives, we're looking at connecting vowels, there's a series of things, and at a certain point you go, well, it has to be this, it can't be anything else. And that's why the master verb chart is so critical for the future of your health in this seminary and in the use of the language. Okay?